Chapter 2. The Bay of Olives. As you left the villa and walked down through the olive groves, you eventually reached the road with its thick coating of white dust, as soft as silk. If you walked along this for half a mile or so, you came to a goat track which led down a steep slope through the olives, and then you reached a small half-moon bay, rimmed with white sands and great piles of dried ribbonweed that had been thrown up by the winter storms and lay along the beach like large, badly made birds' nests. The two arms of the bay were composed of small cliffs, at the base of which were innumerable rock pools filled with the glint and glitter of sea life. As soon as George realised that to incarcerate me every morning of the week in the villa impaired my concentration, he instituted the novel educational gambit of outdoor lessons. The sandy beach and the shaggy piles of weed soon became scorching deserts or impenetrable jungles, and with the aid of a reluctant crab or sandhopper to play the part of Cortez or Marco Polo, we would explore them diligently. Geography lessons done under these circumstances I found had immense charm. We once decided, with the aid of rocks, to do a map of the world along the edge of the sea so that we had real sea. It was an immensely absorbing task, for to begin with, it was not all that easy to find rocks shaped like Africa or India or South America, and sometimes 2 or 3 rocks had to be joined together to give the required shape to the continent. Then, of course, when you were obtaining a rock, you turned it over very carefully and found a host of sea life underneath it, which would keep us both happily absorbed for a quarter of an hour or so, till George realised with a start that this was not getting on with our map of the world. This little bay became one of my favourite haunts, and nearly every afternoon while the family were having their siesta, Roger and I would make our way down through the breathless olive groves, vibrating with the cries of the cicadas, and pad our way along the dusty road, Roger sneezing voluptuously as his great paws stirred up the dust, which went up his nose like snuff. Once we reached the bay, whose waters in the afternoon sun were so still and transparent they did not seem to be there at all, we would swim for a while in the shallows, and then each of us would go about his own particular hobbies. For Roger, this consisted of desperate and unsuccessful attempts to catch some of the small fish that flicked and trembled in the shallow water. He would stalk along slowly, muttering to himself, his ears cocked, gazing down into the water. Then suddenly he would plunge his head beneath the surface, and you heard his jaws clock together, and he would pull his head out, sneeze violently, and shake the water off his fur, while the gobby or blenny that he had been attempting to catch would flip a couple of yards further on and squat on a rock, pouting at him and trembling its tail seductively. For me, the tiny bay was so full of life that I scarcely knew where to begin my collecting. Under and on top of the rocks were the chalky white tunnels of the tube worms, like some swirling and complicated pattern of icing on a cake. And in the slightly deeper water, there were stuck in the sand what appeared to be lengths of miniature hosepipe. If you stood and watched carefully, a delicate feathery flower-like cluster of tentacles would appear at the end of these hosepipes, tentacles of iridescent blue and red and brown that would revolve slowly round and round. These were the bristle worms, a rather ugly name, I felt, for such a beautiful creature. Sometimes there would be little clusters of them, and they looked like a flower bed whose flowers could move. You had to approach them with infinite caution, for should you move your feet too rapidly through the water, you would set up currents that telegraphed your approach, and the tentacles would bunch together and dive with incredible speed back into the tube. Here and there on the sandy floor of the bay were half-moons of black, shiny ribbonweed, looking like dark feather boas anchored to the sand, and in these you would find pipefish, whose heads looked extraordinarily like elongated seahorses perched on the end of a long, slender body. The pipefishes would float upright among the ribbonweeds, which they resembled so closely it required a lot of concentrated searching to find them. Along the shore, under the rocks, you could find tiny crabs or beadlet anemones like scarlet and blue jewelled pincushions, or the snake-clocks anemones, their slender coffee-coloured stalks and long writhing tentacles giving them a hairstyle that Medusa might well have envied. Every rock was encrusted with pink or white or green coral, fine forests of minute seaweeds, including a delicate growth of Acidullaria mediterranea with slender thread-like stalks. And perched on the top of each stalk something that looked like a small green parasol turned inside out by some submarine wind. Occasionally, a rock would be encrusted with a great black lump of sponge covered with gaping, protuberant mouths like miniature volcanoes. You could pull these sponges off the rocks and split them open with a razor blade, for sometimes inside you would find curious forms of life. But the sponge, in retaliation, would coat your hands with a mucus that smelled horribly of stale garlic and took hours to wear off. Scattered along the shore and in the rock pools, I would find new shells to add to my collection. Half the delight of collecting these was not only the beautiful shapes of the shells themselves, but the extraordinarily evocative names that had been given to them. A pointed shell like a large winkle, the lip of whose mouth had been elongated into a series of semi-webbed fingers, was, I discovered to my delight, called the pelican's foot. An almost circular white conical limpet-like shell went under the name of Chinaman's hat. Then there were the arc shells, and the two sides of these strange box-like shells, when separated, did look, if one used a modicum of imagination, like the hulks of two little arcs. Then there were the tower shells, twisted and pointed as a narwhal's horn, and the top shells, gaily striped with a zigzag pattern of scarlet, black, or blue. Under some of the bigger rocks you would find keyhole limpets, each one of which had, as the name implied, a strange keyhole-like aperture in the top of the shell through which the creature breathed. And then, best of all, if you were lucky, you would find the flattened ormes, scaly grey with a row of holes along one side. But if you turned it over and extracted its rightful occupant, you would find the whole interior of the shell glowing in opalescent sunset colours, magical in their beauty. I had at that time no aquarium, so I was forced to construct for myself, in one corner of the bay, a rock pool some 8 feet long by 4 foot wide. Into this I would put my various captures, so that I could almost be certain of knowing where they were on the following day. It was in this bay that I caught my first spider crab, and I would have walked right past him, thinking him to have been a weed-covered rock, if he had not made an incautious movement. His body was about the size and shape of a small flattened pear, and at the pointed end it was decorated with a series of spikes, ending in 2 horn-like protuberances over his eyes. His legs and his pincers were long, slender, and spindly, but the thing that intrigued me most about him was the fact that he was wearing, on his back and on his legs, a complete suit of tiny seaweeds, which appeared to be growing out of his shell. Enchanted by this weird creature, I carried him triumphantly along the beach to my rock pool and placed him in it. The firm grip with which I had to hold him, for once having discovered that he was recognized as a crab, he made desperate efforts to escape, had rubbed off quite a lot of his seaweed suit by the time I got him to the pool. I placed him in the shallow, clear water, and lying on my stomach watched him to see what he would do. Standing high on his toes like a spider in a hurry, he scuttled off a foot or so away from where I'd put him, and then froze. He sat like this for a long time, so long, in fact, that I was just deciding that he was going to remain immobile for the rest of the morning, recovering from the shock of capture, when he suddenly extended a long, delicate claw, and very daintily, almost shyly, proceeded to pluck a tiny piece of seaweed that was growing on a nearby rock. He put the seaweed to his mouth, and I could see him mumbling at it. At first I thought he was eating it, but I soon realized I was mistaken, for with an angular grace he placed his claw over his back, felt around in a rather fumbling sort of way, and then proceeded to plant the tiny piece of weed on his carapace. I presumed that he'd been making the base of the weed sticky with saliva or some similar substance to make it adhere to his back. As I watched him, he trundled slowly round the pool, collecting a variety of seaweed, with the assiduous dedication of a professional botanist in a hitherto unexplored jungle. Within an hour or so, his back was covered with such a thick layer of growth that, if he sat still and I took my eyes off him for a moment, I had difficulty in knowing exactly where he was. Being intrigued by this cunning form of camouflage, I searched the bay carefully until I found another spider crab. For him, I built a special small pool with a sandy floor, completely devoid of weed. I put him in, and he settled down quite happily. The following day I returned, carrying with me a nail brush, which subsequently, rather unfortunately, turned out to be Larry's, and taking up the unfortunate spider crab, I scrubbed him vigorously until not an atom of weed remained upon his back or legs. Then I dropped into his pool a variety of things: a number of tiny top shells and some broken fragments of coral, some sea anemones, and some minute bits of bottle glass that had been sandpapered by the sea so they looked like misty jewels. Then I sat down to watch. The crab, when he returned to his pool, sat quite still for several minutes, obviously recovering from the indignity of the scrubbing I had given him. Then, as if he could not quite believe the terrible fate that had overtaken him, he put his two pincers over his head and proceeded to feel his back with the utmost delicacy, presumably hoping against hope that at least one frond of seaweed remained. But I had done my task well, and his back was shining and bare. He walked a few paces tentatively, and then squatted down and sulked for about half an hour. Then he roused himself out of his gloom and walked over to the edge of the pond, where he endeavoured to wedge himself under a dark ridge of rock. There he sat brooding miserably over his lack of camouflage until it was time for me to go home. I returned very early the next morning, and to my delight, I saw that the crab had been busy while I had been away. Making the best of a bad job, he had decorated the top of his shell with a number of the ingredients that I had left for him. He looked extremely gaudy and had an air of carnival about him. Striped top shells had been pasted on, interspersed with bits of coral, and up near his head he was wearing two beadlet anemones like an extremely saucy bonnet with ribbons. I thought, as I watched him crawling about the sand, that he looked exceedingly conspicuous. But curiously enough, when he went over and squatted by his favourite overhang of rock, he turned into what appeared to be a little pile of shell and coral debris, with a couple of anemones perched on top of it. To the left of the little bay, a quarter of a mile or so from the shore, lay an island called Pondiconisi, or Mouse Island. It was shaped not unlike an isosceles triangle, and was thick with elderly cypress trees and oleander bushes, which guarded a small snow-white church and tiny living quarters adjoining it. This island was inhabited by an elderly and extremely verminous monk, with long black robes and a stovepipe hat, whose major function in life appeared to be ringing the bell in the matchbox-sized church at intervals, and rowing slowly over to a neighbouring headland in the evening, where there was a small nunnery inhabited by 3 ancient nuns. Here he would partake of ouzo and a cup of coffee and discuss, presumably, the state of sin in the world today. And then, as the sun set and turned the calm waters around his island to a multicoloured sheet of shot silk, he would row back again, like a hunched black crow, in his creaking, leaking boat. Margot, having discovered that constant sunbathing, if anything, inflamed her acne, now decided on another of Mother Nature's cures: sea bathing. Every morning she would get up at about 5:30, rout me out of bed, and together we would make our way down to the shore and plunge into the clear water, still chilly from the moon's gaze, and then swim slowly and languidly across to Pondiconisi. Here Margot would drape herself on a rock, and I would potter happily in the rock pools on the shore. Unfortunately, our visitations to the island seemed to have a detrimental effect upon the monk, for no sooner had Margot landed and arranged herself attractively on a rock than he would come stamping down the long flight of stone steps that led up to the church, shaking his fist at her and mouthing incomprehensible Greek from the depths of his long, unkempt beard. Margot would always greet him with a bright smile and a cheerful wave of her hand, and this generally made him almost apoplectic with rage. He would stamp to and fro, his black robe swishing, pointing one dirty and trembling finger at the heavens above and another at Margot. After this had happened on numerous occasions, I managed to commit to memory several of the monk's favourite phrases, for his vocabulary was not an extensive one. I then asked my friend Philemon what they meant. Philemon was convulsed with laughter. He laughed so much that he was almost incapable of explaining to me, but I at length understood that the monk had several derogatory terms that he used for Margot, the mildest of these being white witch. When I related this to Mother, she was, to my astonishment, considerably shocked. "Really," she said, "we ought to report him to somebody. They'd never be able to carry on like that in the Church of England." Eventually, however, The whole thing became a sort of game. When Margot and I swam across, we would take some cigarettes over for the monk, and he would come flying down the stone steps, shaking his fist and threatening us with the wrath of God. And then, having done his duty, as it were, he would hitch up his robes, squat on the wall, and with great good humour smoke the cigarettes we had brought him. Occasionally he would even trot back to the church to bring us a handful of figs from his tree, or a few almonds, milky and fresh, which we would crack between the smooth stones on the beach. Between Pontcanisi and my favourite bay, there stretched a whole string of reefs. Most of these were flat-topped, some of them only the size of a table, and others the size of a small garden. The majority of them lay perhaps 2 inches below the surface of the water, so that if you hauled yourself out and stood on them, from a distance, it looked exactly as though you were walking on the surface of the sea. I had long wanted to investigate these reefs, for they contained a lot of sea life that you did not find in the shallow waters of the bay. But this presented insurmountable difficulties, for I could not get my equipment out there. I had tried to swim out to one reef with 2 large jam jars slung around my neck on a string and carrying my net in one hand, but halfway there the jam jars suddenly and maliciously filled with water, and their combined weight dragged me under. It was a few seconds before I managed to disentangle myself from them and rise gasping and spluttering to the surface, by which time my jars were lying, glinting and rolling in a fathom of water, as irretrievable as though they'd been on the moon. Then, one hot afternoon, I was down in the bay turning over rocks in an effort to find some of the long multicoloured ribbon worms that inhabited that sort of terrain. So absorbed was I in my task that the prow of a rowing boat had scrunched and whispered its way into the sandy shore beside me before I was aware of it. Standing in the stern, leaning on his single oar, which he used, as did all the fishermen, twisting it in the water like a fish's tail, was a young man, burnt almost black by the sun. He had a mop of dark curly hair, eyes as bright and as black as mulberry, and his teeth gleamed astonishingly white in his brown face. "Yasu," he said, "your health." I returned his greeting and watched him as he jumped nimbly out of the boat, carrying a small rusty anchor, which he wedged firmly behind a great double bed of drying seaweed on the beach. He was wearing nothing but a very tattered singlet and a pair of trousers that had once been blue, but were now bleached almost white by the sun. He came over and squatted companionably beside me and produced from his pocket a tin containing tobacco and cigarette papers. "It is hot today," he said, making a grimace, while his blunt, calloused fingers rolled a cigarette with extraordinary deftness. He stuck it in his mouth and lit it with the aid of a large tin lighter, inhaled deeply and then sighed. He cocked an eyebrow at me, his eyes as bright as a robin's. "You're one of the strangers that live up on the hill?" he inquired. By this time my Greek had become reasonably fluent, so I admitted that, yes, I was one of the strangers. "And the others?" he asked. "The others in the villa? Who are they?" I had quickly learned that every Corfiot, particularly the peasants, loved to know all about you, and would, in return for this information, vouchsafe to you the most intimate details of their private lives. I explained that the others at the villa were my mother, my 2 brothers, and my sister. He nodded gravely, as though this information were of the utmost importance. "And your father?" he continued. "Where is your father?" I explained that my father was dead. "Poor thing," he said, quickly commiserating. "And your poor mother with 4 children to bring up." He sighed lugubriously at this terrible thought, and then brightened. "Still," he said philosophically, "thus is life. What are you looking for here under these stones?" I explained as best I could, though I always found it difficult to get the peasants to understand why I was so interested in such a variety of creatures that were either obnoxious or not worth worrying about, and all of which were inedible. "What's your name?" he asked. I said that it was Gerasimos, which was the closest approach to Gerald that one could come up to in Greek. But I explained, my friends called me Gery. "I'm Taki," he said. "Taki Thanatos. I live in Benitsis." I asked him what he was doing up here, so comparatively far from his village. He shrugged. "I have come from Benitsis," he said, "and I fish on the way. Then I eat and I sleep, and when it's night I light my lights and go back to Benitsis fishing again." This news excited me, for not long before We had been returning late from town, and standing on the road by the little path that led up to the villa, we had seen a boat passing below us, being rowed very slowly with a large carbon lamp fixed to the bows. As the fisherman manoeuvred the boat slowly through the dark, shallow waters, the pool of light cast by his lamp had illuminated great patches of seabed with the utmost vividness, reefs smouldering citron green, pink, yellow, and brown as the boat moved slowly along. I had thought at the time that this must be a fascinating occupation, but I had known no fisherman. Now I began to view Taki with some enthusiasm. I asked him eagerly what time he intended to start his fishing, and whether he meant to go round the reefs that lay scattered between the bay and Pondiconisi. "I start about 10, he said. "I walk around the island, and then I head towards Benitez." I asked him whether it would be possible for me to join him because, as I explained, there were lots of strange creatures living on the reef which I could not obtain without the aid of a boat. "Why not?" he said. "I shall be down below Manaus. You come at 10, I'll take you round the reefs and then drop you back at Manaus before I go to Benitez." I assured him fervently that I would be there at 10 o'clock. Then, gathering up my nets and bottles and whistling for Roger, I beat a hasty retreat before Taki could change his mind. Once I was safely out of earshot, I slowed down and gave a considerable amount of thought to how I was going to persuade the family in general, and Mother in particular, to let me go out to sea at 10 o'clock at night. Mother, I knew, had always been worried about my refusal to have a siesta during the heat of the day. I had explained to her that this was generally the best time for insects and things like that, but she was not convinced that this was a valid argument. However, the result was that at night, just when something interesting was happening, such as Larry locked in a verbal battle with Leslie, Mother would say, "It's time you went to bed, dear. After all, remember, you don't have a siesta." This, I felt, might be the answer to night fishing. It was scarcely 3 o'clock, and I knew that the family would be lying supine behind closed shutters, only to awake and start to buzz at each other drowsily, like sun-drugged flies, at about 5:30. I made my way back to the villa with the utmost speed. When I was 100 yards away, I took off my shirt and wrapped it carefully around my jam jars full of specimens, so that not a chink or a rattle would betray my presence. Then, cautioning Roger upon pain of death not to utter a sound, we made our way cautiously into the villa and slipped like shadows into my bedroom. Roger squatted panting in the middle of the floor and viewed me with considerable surprise as I took off all my clothes and climbed into bed. He was not at all sure that he approved of this untoward behaviour. As far as he was concerned, the whole afternoon stretched ahead of us, littered with exciting adventures, and here was I, preparing to go to sleep. He whined experimentally, and I shushed him with such a fierceness that his ears drooped, and putting his stumpy tail between his legs, he crept under the bed and curled up with a rueful sigh. I took a book and tried to concentrate on it. The half-closed shutters made the room look like a cool green aquarium, but in fact the air was still and hot, and the sweat rolled in rivulets down my ribs. What on earth, I thought, shifting uncomfortably on the already sodden sheet, could the family possibly see in a siesta? What good did it do them? In fact, how they managed to sleep at all was a mystery to me. At this moment, I sank swiftly into oblivion. I woke at 5:30 and staggered out, half asleep, to the veranda where the family were having tea. "Good heavens," said Mother, "have you been sleeping?" I said, as casually as I could, that I thought a siesta a good thing that afternoon. "Are you feeling well, dear?" she asked anxiously. I said yes, I felt fine. I had decided to have a siesta in order to prepare myself for that evening. "Why, what's happening, dear?" asked Mother. I said, with all the nonchalance I could muster, that I was going out at 10 o'clock with the fisherman who was going to take me night fishing. For, as I explained, there were certain creatures that came out only at night, and this was the best method of obtaining them. "I hope this does not mean," said Larry ominously, "that we're going to have octopus and conger eels flopping around the floor. Better stop him, Mother. Before you know where you are, the whole villa will look and smell like Grimsby." I replied, somewhat heatedly, that I did not intend to bring the specimens back to the villa, but to put them straight into my special rock pool. "10 o'clock's rather late, dear," said Mother. "What time will you be back?" Lying valiantly, I said I thought I would be back at about 11. Well, mind you wrap up warmly, said Mother, who was always convinced that, in spite of the nights being warm and balmy, I would inevitably end up with double pneumonia if I did not wear a jersey. Promising faithfully to wrap up warmly, I finished my tea and then spent an exciting and satisfying hour or so in marshalling my collecting gear. There was my long-handled net, a long bamboo with 3 wire hooks on the end for pulling interesting clumps of seaweed nearer to one, 8 wide-mouthed jam jars, and several tins and boxes for putting such things as crabs or shells in. Making sure that Mother was not around, I put on my bathing trunks under my shorts and hid a towel in the bottom of my collecting bag, for I felt sure that I might have to dive for some of the specimens. I knew that Mother's fears of double pneumonia would increase 100-fold if she thought I was going to do this. Then, at 9:45, I slung my bag on my back and, taking a torch, made my way down through the olive groves. The moon was a pale, smudged sickle in a starlit sky, shedding only the feeblest light. In the black recesses among the olive roots, glowworms gleamed like emeralds, and I could hear the scops owls calling toink, toink to each other from the shadows. When I reached the beach, I found Taki squatting in his boat smoking. He had already lighted the carbon lamp, and it hissed angrily to itself and smelled strongly of garlic as it cast a brilliant circle of white light into the shallow water by the bows. Already I could see that a host of life had been attracted to it. Gobbies and blennies had come out of their holes and were sitting on the seaweed-covered rocks, pouting and gulping expectantly, like an audience in the theatre waiting for the curtain to go up. Shore crabs scuttled to and fro, pausing now and then to pluck some seaweed delicately and stuff it carefully into their mouths. And everywhere their trundled top shells, dragged by small choleric-looking hermit crabs who now occupied the shells in place of their rightful owners. I arranged my collecting gear in the bottom of the boat and sat down with a contented sigh. Taki pushed off, and then, using the oar, punted us along through the shallow water and the beds of ribbonweed that rustled and whispered along the sides of the boat. As soon as we were in deeper water, he fixed both oars and then started rowing, standing up. We progressed very slowly, Taki keeping a careful eye on the nimbus of light that illuminated the sea bottom for some 12 feet in every direction. The oars squeaked musically, and Taki hummed to himself. Along one side of the boat lay an 8-foot pole ending in a 5-pronged, savagely barbed trident. In the bow, I could see the little bottle of olive oil, such a necessary accoutrement to the fisherman, for should a slight wind blow up and ruffle the waters, a sprinkling of oil would have a magically calming effect on the pleated surface of the sea. Slowly and steadily, we crept out towards the black triangular silhouette of Pondicanosi to where the reefs lay. When we neared them, Taki rested on his oars for a moment and looked at me. "We'll go round and round for 5 minutes," he said, "so that I may catch what there is. Then after that, I will take you round to catch the things that you want." I readily agreed to this, for I was anxious to see how Taki fished with his massive trident. Very slowly, we edged our way round the biggest of the reefs, the light illuminating the strange submarine cliffs covered with pink and purple seaweeds that looked like fluffy oak trees. Peering down into the water, one felt as though one were a kestrel, floating smoothly on outstretched wings over a multicoloured autumn forest. Suddenly, Taki stopped rowing and dug his oars gently into the water to act as a brake. The boat came to an almost complete standstill as he picked up the trident. "Look," he said, pointing to the sandy bottom under a great bulwark of submarine cliffs. "Scorpios." At first glance I could see nothing, then suddenly I saw what he meant. Lying on the sand was a fish some 2 feet long, with a great filigree of sharp spines like a dragon's crest along its back and enormous pectoral fins spread out on the sand. It had a tremendously wide head, with golden eyes and a sulky, pouting mouth. But it was the colours that astonished me, for it was decked out in a series of reds ranging from scarlet to wine, pricked out and accentuated here and there with white. It looked immensely sure of itself as it lay there, flamboyant on the sand, and immensely dangerous too. "This is good eating," whispered Taki to my surprise, for the fish, if anything, looked highly poisonous. Slowly and delicately, he lowered the trident into the water, easing the barbed fork inch by inch towards the fish. There was no sound, except the peevish hissing of the lamp. Slowly, inexorably, the trident got closer and closer. I held my breath. Surely that great fish with its gold-flecked eyes must notice its approaching doom. A sudden flip of the tail, I thought, and a swirl of sand, and it would be gone. But no. It just lay there, gulping methodically and pompously to itself. When the trident was within a foot of it, Taki paused. I saw him gently shift his grip on the haft. He stood immobile for a second, although it seemed an interminable time to me. And then suddenly, so speedily that I did not actually see the movement, he drove the 5 prongs swiftly and neatly through the back of the great fish's head. There was a swirl of sand and blood, and the fish twisted and writhed on the prongs, curling its body so that the spines along its back jabbed at the trident. But Taki had driven the trident home too skillfully, and it could not escape. Quickly, hand over hand, he pulled in the pole, and the fish came over the side and into the boat, flapping and writhing. I came forward to help him get it off the prongs, but he pushed me back roughly. "Take care," he said. "The Scorpios is a bad fish." I watched while, with the aid of the oar blade, he got the fish off the trident, and although to all intents and purposes it must have been dead, it still wriggled and flapped and tried to drive the spines on its back into the side of the boat. "Look, look," said Taki. "You see now why we call it Scorpios. If he can stab you with those spines, Saint Spiridion, what pain you would have. You would have to go to the hospital quickly." With the aid of the oar and the trident and a dexterous bit of juggling, he managed to lift the scorpion fish up and drop it into an empty kerosene tin where it could do no harm. I wanted to know why, if it was poisonous, it was supposed to be good eating. "Ah," said Taki, "it's only the spines. You cut those off. The flesh is sweet as honey. I will give it to you to take home with you." He bent over his oars once more, and we proceeded to squeak our way along the edge of the reef again. Presently he paused once more. Here the seabed was sandy, with just a few scattered tufts of young green ribbonweed. Again he slowed the boat to a standstill and picked up his trident. "Look," he said. "Octopus." My stomach gave a clutch of excitement, for the only octopuses I had seen had been the dead ones on sale in town, and these, I felt sure, bore no resemblance to the living creature. But peer as hard as I could, the sandy bottom appeared to be completely devoid of life. There, said Taki, lowering the trident gently into the water and pointing. "Can't you see it? Did you leave your eyes behind? There, look, I'm almost touching it." Still I could not see it. He lowered the trident another foot. "Now can you see it, foolish one?" he chuckled. "Just at the end of the prongs." And suddenly I could see it. I had been looking at it the whole time, but it was so grey and sand-like that I had mistaken it for part of the seabed. It squatted on the sand in a nest of tentacles, and there under its bald, domed head, its eyes, uncannily human, peered up at us forlornly. "It's a big one," said Taki. He shifted the trident slightly in his grasp, but the movement was incautious. Suddenly, the scorpion turned from a drab sandy colour to a bright and startling iridescent green. It squirted a jet of water out of its siphon, and projected by this in a swirl of sand, it shot off the seabed. Its tentacles trailed out behind it, and as it sped through the water, it looked like a runaway balloon. "Ah, Gamoto," said Taki. He threw the trident down, and seizing the oars, he rowed swiftly in the wake of the octopus. The octopus obviously possessed a touching faith in its camouflage, for it had come to rest on the seabed some 35 feet away. Once again, Taki eased the boat up to it, and once again he lowered the trident carefully into the water. This time he took no risks and made no incautious movements. When the pronged fork was within a foot of the octopus's domed head, Taki strengthened his grip on the pole and plunged it home. Immediately, the silver sand boiled up in a cloud as the octopus's tentacles threshed and writhed and wound themselves around the trident. Ink spurted from its body and hung like a trembling curtain of black lace or coiled like smoke across the sand. Taki was chuckling now with pleasure. He hauled the trident up swiftly, and as the octopus came into the boat, 2 of its tentacles seized and adhered to the side. Taki gave a sharp tug, and the tentacles were pulled free with a ripping, rasping noise that was like the sound of sticking plaster being removed 1,000 times magnified. Swiftly, Taki grabbed the round, slimy body of the octopus and deftly removed it from the prongs, and then, to my astonishment, he lifted this writhing Medusa head and put it to his face, so that the tentacles wound around his forehead, his cheeks, and his neck, the suckers leaving white impressions against his dark skin. Then, choosing his spot carefully, he suddenly buried his teeth in the very core of the creature with a snap and a sideways jerk, reminiscent of a terrier breaking the back of a rat. He'd obviously bitten through some vital nerve centre, for immediately the tentacles released their grip on his head and fell limply, only their very extremities twitching and curling slightly. Taki threw the octopus into the tin with the scorpion fish and spat over the side of the boat, and then, reaching over, cupped a handful of seawater and swilled his mouth out with it. "You have brought me luck," he said, grinning and wiping his mouth. "It is not many nights I get an octopus and a scorpios." But apparently Taki's luck stopped short at the octopus, for although we circled the reef several times, we caught nothing more. We did see the head of a moray eel sticking out of its hole in the reef, an extremely vicious-looking head, the size of a small dog's. But when Taki lowered the trident, the moray eel, very smoothly and with much dignity, retreated with the fluid grace into the depths of the reef, and we did not see him again. For myself, I was quite glad, for I imagined he must have been about 6 foot long, and to wrestle about in a dimly lit boat with a 6-foot moray eel was an experience that even I, ardent naturalist though I was, felt I could do without. "Ah, well," said Taki philosophically, "now let us go and do your fishing." He rowed me out to the largest of the reefs and landed me with my gear on its flat top. Armed with my net, I prowled along the edge of the reef while Taki rowed the boat some 6 feet behind me, illuminating the smouldering beauty of the rocks. There was so much life that I despaired of being able to capture it all. There were fragile blennies decked out in gold and scarlet, tiny fish half the size of a matchstick with great black eyes and pillar-box red bodies, and others the same size, whose colouring was a combination of deep Prussian and pale powder blue. There were blood-red starfish and purple brittle starfish, their long, slender, spiky arms forever coiling and uncoiling. These had to be lifted in the net with the utmost delicacy for the slightest shock, and they would, with gay abandon, shed all their arms lavishly. There were slipper limpets that, when you turned them over, you found had half the underside covered by a neat flange of shell, so that the whole thing did look rather like a baggy, shapeless carpet slipper designed for a gouty foot. Then there were cowries, some as white as snow and delicately ribbed, others a pale cream, heavily blotched and smudged with purple-black markings. Then there were the coat of male shells, or chitons, some 2.5 inches long, that clung to crannies in the rocks, looking like gigantic woodlice. I saw a baby cuttlefish, the size of a matchbox, and almost fell off the edge of the reef in my efforts to capture him, but to my immense chagrin, he escaped. After only half an hour of collecting, I found that my jars, tins, and boxes were crammed to overflowing with life, and I knew that, albeit reluctantly, I would have to stop. Taki, very good-humouredly, rowed me over to my favourite bay and stood watching with amusement whilst I carefully emptied my jars of specimens into my rock pool. Then he rowed me back to the jetty below Menelaus. Here he strung a cord through the gills of the now dead scorpionfish and handed it to me. "Tell your mother," he said, "to cook it with hot paprika and oil and potatoes and little marrows. It is very sweet." I thanked him for this, and for the fact that he'd been so patient with me. "Come fishing again," he said. "I shall be up here next week, probably Wednesday or Thursday. I'll send a message to you when I arrive." I thanked him and said I would look forward to it. He pushed the boat off and poled his way through the shallow waters, heading in the direction of Benitsis. I shouted, "Be happy," after him. "Pasto Carlo," he answered. "Go to the good." I turned and trudged my way wearily up the hill. I discovered to my horror that it was 2:30, and I knew Mother would by now have convinced herself that I'd been drowned or eaten by a shark or overtaken by some similar fate. However, I hoped that the scorpion fish would placate her.